Tonight, we walk with heavy shoes along a tarmac bathed in Mediterranean heat. Reporters squint behind cameras, motorcades gleam under the July sun. And from the creaking stairs of Air Force One, a stiff-suited Richard Nixon descends with a wave America's first sitting president to set foot on Israeli soil. His smile is thin, more rehearsed than warm. You can practically feel the sweat trickling beneath that collar, not just from the weather, but from what this visit means. Because behind the diplomatic protocol and obligatory handshakes, there's a swirling mess of Cold War calculations, domestic distractions, and the creeping shadow of Watergate that Nixon hopes foolishly won't follow him across the Atlantic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere cozy, drop your location and local time in the comments. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in June of 1974. Tel Aviv is abuzz. There are red carpets, ceremonial kisses on cheeks, and nervous glances exchanged between military officials and Mossad operatives in the crowd. Israel is just 26 years old and still reeling from the Yom Kippur War the previous autumn. America's relationship with Israel had shifted from arm's length to full embrace under Nixon, especially after the massive US airlift of supplies that helped Israel recover from early losses in the war. And here's the kicker. Nixon, already embroiled in a political unraveling back home, decides that now is the moment to become the first US president to visit. The timing was anything but casual. Some historians argue that Nixon wanted to distract the American public from the Watergate scandal closing in around him. Others suggest he aimed to cement his Cold War legacy by visibly shoring up one of America's most loyal allies in a Soviet-touched region. Israel, for its part, welcomed the gesture like a long-lost family reunion. Streets were lined with children waving US and Israeli flags. Newspapers printed headlines in English just for the occasion. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the clatter of typewriters in Jerusalem's press rooms racing to document every breath of the trip. And then there's Golda Meir. Well, sort of. Though she had already resigned as Prime Minister earlier that year, her presence loomed large. Nixon had a complicated admiration for her. He once described her as the only man in the Israeli cabinet, which is both wildly outdated and weirdly flattering coming from him. During this trip, Nixon met instead with her successor, Yitzhak Rabin, who was just weeks into office and already juggling the competing demands of American gratitude and regional hostility. You ride along in a black Cadillac as Nixon's motorcade snakes past white stone buildings and citrus trees, flanked by security more intense than a Bond film. The visit is short, less than 2 days, but strategically packed. There are speeches about peace, tours of Israeli military installations, and the whispered affirmations behind closed doors about continuing the flow of American aid and advanced weaponry. But here's a fringe detail to keep your dreams slightly more surreal. Tonight, Nixon reportedly had a strange affinity for Israeli intelligence. He trusted them more than the CIA, even occasionally preferring Mossad briefings when the intel involved the Middle East. Some even speculate he sought Israeli counsel on sensitive Arab negotiations. Historians still argue whether that made him pragmatic or paranoid, or possibly just desperate for an intelligence source that wouldn't leak to the Washington Post. As night falls on Jerusalem, Nixon lights a ceremonial flame at Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial. He's visibly moved. It's the one moment where his expression softens, where he's no longer the embattled president of a scandal-ridden superpower, but simply a man confronting history. The scene lingers, it echoes, and perhaps it seeps into his later policies because just 2 months after this visit, Nixon resigns in disgrace. His Israel trip becomes a historical footnote overshadowed by tapes, trials, and a nation's trust shattered. And yet he opened a door, or rather a sky bridge. Every president after Nixon would be measured against this visit, not just whether they went, but when. Did they go early? Did they wait? Did they visit Israel before Palestine? Did they make a speech, stand by the Western Wall, shake hands in East Jerusalem, or avoid it like a diplomatic landmine? Tonight you start to see why Nixon's trip wasn't just symbolic, it was sticky. It clung to the expectations of American foreign policy like hummus clings to Peter. Not visiting Israel became suspicious. Visiting too early became political. And visiting late, well, that came with its own thunderclouds, but Nixon, bless his sweating collar, didn't know any of that yet. He just needed a win. You drift now into a quieter, wooded corner of Maryland, where the trees breathe with you and time settles. It's 1978. The president is Jimmy Carter, and you can almost feel the Georgia humidity that still clings to his skin despite the cool, forested shade of Camp David. A devout Baptist with a farmer's patience, Carter isn't known for charisma, but he's about to wrangle the unthinkable peace between Egypt and Israel. You watch as he paces the cabin floor yellow legal pad in hand, scribbling notes between sips of lukewarm coffee and hushed conversations with advisors who know how impossible this all seems. He's not here for photo ops. He's here because he believes in something utterly inconvenient for any realist politician, that peace is possible, and that if he could just keep Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin within walking distance for long enough, maybe, just maybe, they'd talk like humans instead of heads of state. Camp David, for its part, is far from glamorous, a sprawl of log cabins, deer trails, and quiet decks overlooking quiet trees. But Carter weaponizes that simplicity. He strips the noise away. No media circus, no red carpets, no orchestra of flashing bulbs, just pine needles underfoot and the sense that the world is watching from a polite distance. The meetings are grueling. Sadat and Begin clash over everything land borders recognition language. One night, Begin reportedly refuses to speak altogether. Another day, Sadat threatens to leave. Carter's aides beg him to let them go, but he doesn't. Instead, he writes each leader a personal letter, appealing to their legacy, their children, even their faith. And here's your quirky tidbit to float on tonight. Carter, at one point, used his own daughter's drawings, yes, Amy Carter's literal crayon sketches, as a peace-building tool, passing them between the two men as gentle reminders of innocence and shared humanity. Historians still argue whether that was effective diplomacy or just Southern charm at its most desperate, but either way, something about it worked. Because on September 17, 1978, after 13 days of negotiations, they signed the Camp David Accords. Egypt would recognize Israel. Israel would return the Sinai Peninsula. The Middle East would hold its breath. And Jimmy Carter, he would cry. Right there at the podium, with both men flanking him, he let the tears fall. The photo captures all of it. Carter weeping, Begin solemn Sadat, half smiling like someone who just felt history shift under their feet. And you start to feel something else, that this was a turning point not just for the region, but for the US presidency itself. Because after Carter, no president could pretend to be a neutral observer. The US was now a peace broker, a referee, a funder, and an enabler. Visiting Israel would no longer be symbolic, it would be expected, even demanded. You'd go not to shake hands, but to solve things. Carter's post-presidency is often remembered for his humanitarian work and peanut farming, but in Israel they remember him as the president who brought peace, at least for a time. Still, he never quite recovered politically. The very same allies who praised his Middle East triumph would later accuse him of being weak on Iran, tone-deaf on inflation, and too nice for Cold War politics. His next visit to Israel, not as president, but as an aging diplomat long after he'd left the Oval Office. But don't drift too far just yet, because this new standard Carter set, it wasn't entirely embraced. In fact, the very next president, Ronald Reagan, decided not to visit Israel at all. And yet, oddly enough, Israel never had more American support than under his watch. So rest your eyes on this scene where the soft rustle of Camp David's pines has barely faded, and already the expectations for presidential involvement in Israel have been cemented like footpaths in wet cement. Every president after Carter would carry a mental suitcase full of "when are you going to Israel" questions, and every answer, early, late, or never, would speak volumes. But on this night, in the stillness of the Maryland forest, Carter doesn't know that yet. He only knows that for once, diplomacy didn't require a red carpet. Just patience, persistence, and maybe one child's crayon sketch of a dove. You're now gliding into the glossy mirage of the 1980s where movie stars become presidents. Jelly beans fill the White House jars and Cold War rhetoric hums beneath every diplomatic encounter like an electric fence. Ronald Reagan, with his easy charm and cowboy grin, leads the United States into an era of bold gestures and calculated silences. But here's what might surprise you. Despite being arguably one of Israel's strongest supporters in history, Reagan never visited Israel as president. Not once, not even for a quick photo at the Knesset or a token stopover in Tel Aviv. He managed to beam unwavering support from 6,000 miles away with the kind of long-distance relationship that somehow still made headlines. Now, before you go thinking that absence meant apathy, don't. Reagan's policies were a full-throttle endorsement of Israel's strategic importance in the Middle East. Under his administration, military aid to Israel ballooned. Intelligence sharing deepened. American-made F-16s roared through Israeli skies. Reagan even signed a strategic cooperation agreement that practically handcuffed the two countries together against Soviet influence in the region. It was like being best friends without ever showing up to their birthday party and somehow still getting credit for the cake. You sit in the West Wing listening to Reagan's aides debate whether he should go. Some argue that a visit would make Arab allies squirm. Others warn that Reagan's own diplomatic dance with Lebanon, especially after the 1982 Sabra and Shatila massacres, makes a presidential visit too politically flammable. Remember, this is a man who had to explain to a grieving nation why 241 US Marines were killed in a Beirut bombing. It wasn't the time for photo ops, and Reagan knew optics better than most. He didn't want to fan a fire he couldn't put out. Still, his affection for Israel was no secret. He famously compared the founding of Israel to America's own city on a hill. And for your fringe fact pillow tonight, Reagan once gifted Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir a copy of an old Hollywood Western, his own film. A VHS of that Hagen Girl in which Reagan plays a small-town lawyer. Shamir never publicly commented on the acting, but let's assume it wasn't about the Oscar. What's more, Reagan helped redefine the ideological foundation of US-Israel ties. He emphasized shared Judeo-Christian values, the idea of democracy in the Middle East, and the portrayal of Israel as a moral counterweight to Soviet-aligned regimes. Evangelical Christians rallied behind him not just because of economic policies or anti-communism, but because he projected a messianic sense of purpose. Israel was not just an ally, it was part of prophecy, a narrative arc that many of his supporters believed must be fulfilled. Historians still argue whether Reagan's refusal to visit Israel in person was a missed opportunity or a masterstroke of indirect diplomacy. On the one hand, his speeches and aid packages kept Israeli officials feeling valued. On the other, some Israeli critics quietly wished he'd land a plane, just once shake a hand, offer a toast. Because no matter how warm the words, geography still matters. And standing on the soil of a country, walking its streets, visiting its memorials, speaks a different kind of truth. But Reagan's impact didn't fade. In fact, his era helped shape the conditions for every president after him, because now American presidents couldn't just support Israel from afar, they had to show it. A trip became a symbol, a rite of passage, and Reagan, by not going, set the bar even higher for those who would come next. You stretch now into a quiet evening at the Israeli embassy in Washington, where diplomats are still sipping sweet wine and reminiscing about the Reagan years. They talk about missile defense cooperation, the 1985 Free Trade Agreement, America's first, by the way, with Israel, and the subtle but firm hand of a president who preferred letters and satellites to handshakes and headlines. So you ask, did Reagan need to visit Israel? Maybe not. But after his presidency, the stakes had changed. A visit wasn't just a friendly gesture, it was an obligation, a checkpoint on the global itinerary of American power. Because if the Gipper, with all his love and largesse, never made the flight, then surely everyone else had to. And as the 1980s fade into synth music and red-tinted world maps, Air Force One is already gassing up for another president, one who will go, and not without ruffling a few feathers along the way. You step now into a quieter, less glamorized era, 1991 to be exact. The Cold War is over, but the dust hasn't settled. You're watching President George H.W. Bush, measured and polite, a Yale man with CIA roots, and an oil-soaked resume stride cautiously through the minefield that is Middle East diplomacy. His tone is cooler than Reagan's. No cowboy metaphors, no Bible verses, just that New England accent and a penchant for geopolitical order. And for a brief uncomfortable moment in US-Israel relations, that cooler tone makes headlines. Bush does eventually go to Israel, but not as president. During his actual presidency, despite the post-Gulf War victory and an emerging sense that America could now strong-arm just about anyone into peace talks, he skips the trip. Not out of indifference, but because he's too busy doing something few presidents ever dare, saying no. Yes, really. In 1991, Israel requests $10 billion in US loan guarantees to help absorb a massive wave of Jewish immigrants fleeing the collapsing Soviet Union. Bush hesitates. Why? Because Israel is continuing to build settlements in the occupied territories, and Bush wants that to stop, or at least slow down before signing any checks. The Israeli government, led by Yitzhak Shamir, is not pleased. The American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, the most influential pro-Israel lobbying group, mobilizes with all the quiet fury of a polite hurricane. You can almost hear the gasps in Washington, a US president publicly pressuring Israel on settlements. In an election year, historians still argue whether Bush was driven by diplomatic principle or just overconfident from his Gulf War success, but either way the clash defined a whole chapter of the relationship. Bush famously complained he was one lonely little guy, standing against 1,000 lobbyists on the Hill, which as far as presidential soundbites go might be the most tragically honest thing he ever said. Meanwhile, back in Israel, the headlines scream betrayal. Bush isn't seen as anti-Israel exactly, but he's definitely not seen as reflexively pro. Still, the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991 happens under his watch, bringing Israelis and Palestinians to the same negotiating table for the first time since, well, ever. It's not a breakthrough, more like an awkward family dinner with lots of staring and no dessert, but it sets a precedent. Your quirky detail for tonight's soft descent Bush once sent Prime Minister Shamir a fountain pen as a personal gift to encourage him to sign on to the peace process. Shamir reportedly kept it sealed, in its case unopened. Interpret that however you wish. Bush's approach was methodical, reserved, and to some Israeli officials chilly. But here's the thing, his actions, his resistance to pressure, his prioritizing of Palestinian representation all signaled a temporary shift in US policy. It wasn't permanent, and it certainly wasn't popular among certain constituencies back home, but it showed that American presidents could at least, for a moment, push back on Israel without the sky falling. And yet, he paid a political price. The 1992 election saw him swept aside by a saxophone-playing governor from Arkansas who understood something Bush didn't. The optics of friendship mattered, especially in a country like Israel, where symbolism and support are often measured not just in aid, but in airplane tickets and shoe soles worn thin on Jerusalem stone. Bush would eventually visit Israel in 1998, long after leaving office, where he received a surprisingly warm welcome. Time had softened the memories. He met with Benjamin Netanyahu, planted a tree, toured the old city, but by then his image had already settled into history, the president who gave Israel money with strings attached and then lost re-election. Some say the two things weren't related, others aren't so sure. And as you drift deeper into your pillow, the lesson lingers like incense. Refusing to visit may not doom a presidency, but it will raise eyebrows. Especially after Nixon's first Carter's gamble and Reagan's long-distance devotion. By the early 90s, visiting Israel was becoming more than a gesture, it was a statement. And George H.W. Bush, for better or worse, made his by staying home. But not for long, because the man who replaces him would waste no time packing his bags, offering hugs, and whispering peace dreams across every microphone he could find, sometimes even when the room wasn't asking. You stir into the mid-1990s now, where saxophones hum under campaign banners and optimism clings to everything like dew. Bill Clinton is in office a president younger, looser, and far more tactile than any before him. You watch as he strides toward the tarmac in Tel Aviv, arms wide tie, slightly askew face breaking into that signature all-teeth grin. Unlike Reagan or Bush, Sr., Clinton visits Israel multiple times during his presidency, and each time it feels less like a diplomatic errand and more like a reunion. He's not just the American president, he's the affable cousin who brings gifts and calls you by your nickname. Clinton is all in on the peace process. In fact, his presidency becomes inseparable from it. He doesn't just visit Israel, he becomes part of its political weather, the Oslo Accords. He hosts the signing on the White House lawn in 1993. That iconic handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, with Clinton physically guiding their hands together like a Middle Eastern marriage counselor. Yep, that's him. And he goes back again in 1994 and again in 1996. Each trip is carefully choreographed, yet Clinton brings this strange, very American informality to every meeting, every toast, every grin. You feel like he'd high-five the chief rabbi if protocol allowed it. But it's not all smiles. In November 1995, everything changes. Rabin Clinton's closest Israeli partner, the general-turned-peacemaker, is assassinated by an Israeli ultranationalist, a political earthquake, a psychic wound, and suddenly Clinton's role becomes something far more intimate. He arrives for the funeral not as a negotiator, but as a mourner. And that's where the history slows down for a second. You watch him stand before Rabin's casket, voice trembling, pausing between syllables to hold back tears, and say simply, "Shalom Chaver." Goodbye, friend. The phrase sticks. It's printed on posters across Tel Aviv. Teenagers carve it into notebooks. People say it at vigils. And in that moment, Clinton becomes more than a foreign leader. He becomes part of the grief, part of the national story. Historians still argue whether Clinton's involvement in Oslo was overly idealistic, doomed from the start, or simply ahead of its time. But no one questions the emotional footprint he left behind. Clinton cared, visibly, clumsily, and completely. Here's your quirky bedtime detail. On one of his trips, Clinton reportedly asked for a midnight tour of the Old City in Jerusalem. Surrounded by Secret Service and stone arches, he lingered near the Western Wall longer than scheduled, scribbling something on a piece of paper and tucking it between the stones like countless visitors before him. What he wrote remains a mystery. Some say it was a prayer for peace. Others joke it was his saxophone chord progression for the next press conference. Either way, the wall keeps its secrets. And Clinton's last visit to Israel as president in 2000 takes place under much gloomier skies. The Camp David summit that summer, a desperate bid to reach a final status agreement between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat, collapses in frustration and finger-pointing. Clinton flies home exhausted. The Second Intifada erupts weeks later. His legacy, once tied to hope, now drags a bittersweet tale behind it. Peace seemed within reach, but the grasp wasn't strong enough. And yet his visits mattered. You drift past a Tel Aviv cafe where young adults still talk about Clinton time as a brief golden age. Streets named after Rabin now carry echoes of that American drawl, the Shalom Shava, that still stings. For Israelis, Clinton wasn't just another president in a suit. He showed up, again and again. He laughed, he cried, he pushed. And as the decade closes with a noisy blend of hope and heartache, the precedent becomes clear. Future presidents wouldn't just be expected to support Israel, they'd be expected to participate. You had to fly in, walk the grounds, speak the words, and live the drama. Anything less would seem distant, cold, insincere. So as you drift off amid the echoes of Clinton's earnest diplomacy, you realize this wasn't just about handshakes or press statements. It was about presence, about being there when history cracked open, whether for a treaty or a funeral. And from this point forward, no American president could afford to miss that, because now not going wasn't neutral, it was a statement. You wake to the heavy boots of the 2000s, where dust clings to headlines and the world rearranges itself after September 11th. President George W. Bush walks onto the global stage with a southern drawl and a moral clarity that doesn't leave much room for ambiguity, and for Israel that's both reassuring and unnerving. Bush has an affinity for the country rooted in personal faith, political alliances, and a growing sense that Israel's battle against terror mirrors America's own. But, strangely enough, it isn't until the last year of his presidency that he finally visits. He waits 8 long years, 2 full terms before Air Force One finally touches down at Ben Gurion Airport in January 2008. So what took so long? After all, Bush was seen as one of Israel's staunchest allies, pushing record-breaking military aid and defending Israel's security posture with unwavering loyalty. But in the early years of his presidency, Bush wasn't thinking about ceremonial visits or photo ops in Jerusalem. He was thinking about Afghanistan, Iraq, the so-called axis of evil. His view of the Middle East was shaped not by settlements and ceasefires, but by IED's regime change and the roar of Black Hawk helicopters in Fallujah. Still, Bush and Israel were never far apart. He called Ariel Sharon a man of peace, even as the Israeli leader launched harsh military responses to the Second Intifada. He pushed for the isolation of Hamas. He green-lit Israel's right to defend itself in language that critics called dangerously vague and supporters called refreshingly blunt. And while Bush didn't always walk the halls of the Knesset, his policies were being felt just as strongly as if he had. Here's your quirky fact for the night. In 2002, the Bush administration coined the phrase roadmap to peace, a carefully scripted diplomatic plan that was supposed to lead to a 2-state solution. The plan was laid out like a GPS phases benchmarks destination, but as some diplomats joked at the time, it might have needed a better Wi-Fi signal. Historians still argue whether the roadmap was a serious strategy or just a formalized fantasy because it never really got out of the driveway. And yet Bush's eventual trip in 2008 wasn't just a box-checking exercise, it was a full embrace of symbolism. 60 years after Israel's founding, Bush gave speeches about democracy, resilience, and the shared values of the two nations. He toured Yad Vashem, pausing for minutes too long at the Hall of Names. He met with Holocaust survivors. He stood with Israeli leaders and promised America is proud to be your closest ally and best friend. But underneath the warm rhetoric, there was a quiet panic. The peace process had stalled again. Israeli settlements had expanded. Palestinian leadership was fractured, and Bush's once hopeful freedom agenda in the Middle East was now tangled in blood and bureaucracy. The Iraq War had gone sideways. Afghanistan dragged on. And while Bush was warmly welcomed in Jerusalem, there were whispers about lost opportunities, about American distraction, about the fading dream of Oslo. And that's where the evangelical alignment comes in. George W. Bush, a born-again Christian, was surrounded by advisors and voters for whom support for Israel wasn't just political, it was spiritual, biblical even. The book of Genesis, the return to Zion, the land granted by God, all of it infused the relationship with a sense of destiny. Many evangelicals viewed Israel not merely as a democratic ally, but as a fulfillment of prophecy. And Bush, whether or not he quoted scripture, knew how deeply that belief shaped his base. That's why the delay in visiting never translated into a loss of trust. Israelis understood that Bush's support was baked into policy ideology and belief. Even without an early trip, his presidency was seen as one of unprecedented friendship. Aid flowed, vetoes were cast at the UN, red lines were drawn. And by the time he finally came in person, he was greeted like someone who'd been there all along. So, as you rest against the hum of Air Force One over the Mediterranean, you begin to see a new pattern. Presidential visits to Israel weren't just about timing, they were about tone. Nixon was strategic, Carter was emotional, Reagan was distant but loyal. Bush Sr. was cautious, Clinton was ever present, and Bush Jr., he was late but never absent in spirit. Because even when the president doesn't step onto Israeli soil, until his 8th year in office, the connection can still be loud enough to echo through every corridor in Jerusalem. And by now the idea is clear. Every US president will visit Israel. The only question is when and what they bring with them. Now you shift into a cooler palette, January 2009, where the world has just watched history made under clouded Washington skies. Barack Obama takes the oath with millions watching, hopeful that something new might begin. He's young, eloquent, biracial, and carries the weight of expectation like a well-tailored overcoat. And for the first time in decades, a US president delays his visit to Israel, not for months, but for years. And oh, the conversations that delay inspires. Obama does not land at Ben Gurion Airport until March 2013, over 4 years into his presidency. The gap becomes a diplomatic Rorschach test. Some see it as cautious strategy, others see disrespect. It's not that Obama ignored Israel, far from it. But in a break from tradition, his first major Middle East speech wasn't delivered in Jerusalem. It was in Cairo, Egypt. To a crowd of students, scholars and reformers, the speech an open hand to the Muslim world, a reset, a promise that America was not at war with Islam. And Israel watched with a raised eyebrow. Obama's relationship with Israel, and especially with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, was famously, let's say, icy. They disagreed on almost everything Iran settlements, red lines, tone. Obama pushed hard for a freeze on settlement expansion. Netanyahu, increasingly cozy with a Republican-dominated Congress, pushed right back. Their meetings were strained. Their body language went viral. Historians still argue whether their animosity was personal or philosophical, but either way it became one of the defining dynamics of Obama's foreign policy. And yet when Obama did visit in 2013, he played the role of peacemaker with theatrical elegance. He toured Iron Dome batteries, praised technological cooperation, visited the grave of Theodore Herzl, and gave a speech directly to Israeli youth, skipping the Knesset entirely. In that speech he said, "Put yourself in their shoes," referring to Palestinians. A phrase that landed like a dropped plate. Progressive Israelis cheered, others fumed. Obama had spoken with empathy, yes, but in a room that didn't want lessons in moral equivalency. Still, the visit mattered. He connected, he explained, he reaffirmed American commitment to Israeli security and shared democratic values. But he also reminded Israelis gently but firmly that friendship includes honesty, and sometimes honesty stings more than silence. Here's your quirky nighttime detail. On this same trip, Obama's armored limousine, nicknamed the Beast, broke down after staff accidentally filled it with diesel instead of gasoline. A second Beast had to be flown in from Jordan. So, somewhere between Herzl's grave and the King David Hotel, the most powerful car in the world had to wait for roadside assistance. Even empires stall sometimes. But by the time Obama left, something else had shifted. He hadn't erased the tension, but he'd shown up. He'd looked people in the eye, and his visit, though late, brought a kind of closure to the anxiety that had loomed for years. Still back home, critics claimed he was anti-Israel, a myth reinforced during his administration's final days when the US abstained, rather than vetoed, a UN resolution condemning Israeli settlements. It was the diplomatic equivalent of a door left ajar as you leave the room. And yet Obama also signed the largest military aid package to Israel in US history, $38 billion over 10 years. An awkward paradox, rhetorically challenging, materially unwavering. The relationship had matured, maybe even aged, no longer all smiles and shoulder pats, but durable, strategic, necessary. As you close your eyes to the echo of Obama's carefully measured voice, you notice something about this stage of presidential visits. They're no longer just affirmations of loyalty. They're platforms for debate. Moments to test values, to argue publicly even while shaking hands. And you realize this too, every delay, every detour, every deviation from the expected route carries its own meaning. By waiting 4 years, Obama reminded everyone that visiting Israel isn't a formality, it's a statement. And the longer you wait, the louder that statement becomes. So now, with Jerusalem quiet again, and the Beast tucked safely into a motorcade garage, you drift forward into the next act, where diplomatic theater becomes full-blown spectacle, and where subtlety gives way to stagecraft. Now the lights change, cue the marching band, roll out the red carpet with extra sequins, because when Donald J. Trump visits Israel, it's not diplomacy, it's theater. The year is 2017, and for the first time in history, a sitting US president flies directly from Riyadh to Tel Aviv, a subtle, shimmering move that suggests perhaps that the winds of Arab-Israeli relations are shifting. And as you float along above the glittering tarmac, you can already tell this trip isn't about nuance, it's about announcement. Trump lands with Melania at his side, dressed like she's about to inspect the Louvre. The mood is a cocktail of pomp pressure and paparazzi flashes. He's greeted by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu with the kind of grin you reserve for the arrival of an eccentric uncle who also happens to control your military funding. Trump offers greetings that wobble between heartfelt and haphazard, telling reporters, for instance, that he just got back from the Middle East, which, geographically, isn't wrong but also isn't totally right. But the moment that crystallizes the visit comes not with words but with action: Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and relocate the US embassy from Tel Aviv. That announcement came months before the trip, but here on the ground its weight becomes tangible. Israelis are ecstatic, Palestinians are furious, world leaders flinch. Historians still argue whether it was a bold correction of diplomatic doublespeak or a reckless provocation that derailed decades of peacemaking. And yet the embassy move goes ahead. In 2018, the new US embassy opens in Jerusalem. The ceremony is televised, saturated in American flags, gospel music, and evangelical invocations. Absent from the festivities, most of the diplomatic corps. Also, a sizable portion of American Jews who felt the move was overly political. But none of that rattles Trump, who basks in the moment like a developer, admiring a freshly cut ribbon. Here's a fringe bedtime nugget during his Israel trip. Trump visited the Western Wall, becoming the first sitting US president to do so. Alone with a solemn expression and a yarmulke gently pressed against his swept-back hair, he places a folded note into the wall's cracks. What he wrote, unknown. What he tweeted later, slightly less mysterious. He called it a great honor. Photos of that moment raced across the world, praised and mocked in equal measure. And then there's the Abraham Accords, brokered in 2020 between Israel and several Arab states, namely the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. These agreements normalize relations without resolving the Palestinian question. They sidestep it, really. Trump positions the Accords as the greatest Middle East peace breakthrough since Carter, though their longevity and transformative power remain open questions. Still, his administration earns genuine praise for facilitating them, even from longtime skeptics. Trump's visit rewrites the pageantry. No careful balancing act between Israel and Palestine. No vague gestures toward future talks. Just bold moves, direct flights, and a complete embrace of Israel's nationalist government. Netanyahu calls him the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House. Billboards go up in Jerusalem showing the two leaders shaking hands like a campaign ad made for the heavens. But beneath the flash friction simmers. Palestinian protests erupt. Gaza ignites. Trump's deal of the century, unveiled in 2020, is largely rejected by Palestinians who weren't meaningfully consulted. The vision of a Palestinian state offered was fragmented, provisional, and riddled with conditions. Still, the Trump administration presses ahead with its version of peace, transactional, unapologetic, disruptive. Historians still debate the long-term effects of Trump's Israel policy. Did it expand Israel's diplomatic horizons? Undoubtedly. Did it move peace further from Palestinian reach? Quite possibly. But one thing's certain: no president had visited with more ceremony, more confidence, or more confetti. As you sink deeper into your pillow, the sound of gospel choirs from that embassy ceremony still echo faintly. You feel the warmth of Jerusalem's stone against the soles of Air Force One's tires. And you realize something else: the visit wasn't just a symbol. It was a pivot, a signal to the world that US policy on Israel could change not just in tone, but in tectonic plates. And so by now it's settled every president will visit. But what they do once they land, that's where the story really begins. And with Trump, the page turned loud enough to wake the neighbors. Now the tempo slows again, the colors soften, and a more familiar face returns, not new, but aged. President Joe Biden steps off Air Force One in July 2022, his gait steady but careful, his aviators glinting under the Israeli sun. He's no stranger to these streets. He's been coming here since the 1970s, back when Golda Meir was Prime Minister, and his hairline was still optimistic. And though this is his first visit as president to many Israelis, it feels like welcoming an old friend, one who's dropped by so many times you've already set his favorite seat at the table. But the world has changed since his earlier visits. The Trump years altered the playing field. The Abraham Accords redrew alliances, the Iran nuclear deal, brokered under Obama and torpedoed under Trump, is still smoldering in the background. And Biden, ever the institutionalist, is trying to restore a sense of order to a region that has grown accustomed to disruption. Unlike Trump, Biden doesn't arrive with a thunderclap. There's no embassy ribbon cutting, no oversized declarations. Instead, he brings an agenda of quiet reassurance. US support remains strong, Iron Dome funding is secure, and cooperation in tech, energy, and security will continue. His tone is diplomatic balm after years of geopolitical caffeine. His speeches hit the familiar notes: shared values, democratic kinship, and the importance of peace. But they're delivered with grandfatherly calm, not theatrical flair. Still, Biden doesn't escape scrutiny. He meets with Israeli leaders, but also makes a symbolic stop in East Jerusalem, becoming the first sitting US president to do so without being accompanied by Israeli officials. A subtle nod to Palestinian sovereignty, or at least a respectful wink in that direction. And then he travels to Bethlehem to meet with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. The mood is respectful but distant. Promises of aid are made, but no grand vision is laid out. There's a sense that the old peace process isn't asleep, it's on life support. Historians still argue whether Biden's approach is strategic patience or just a reflection of limited bandwidth. With war in Ukraine, inflation back home, and a pandemic still buzzing in the corners of public health, Middle East diplomacy has taken a back seat to more pressing fires. Still, Biden knows the choreography of these visits. He lays a wreath at Yad Vashem, speaks with Holocaust survivors, and gets visibly emotional, one of the few unscripted moments that cuts through the protocol. You feel just briefly the sincerity in his silence. Here's your quirky bedtime nugget. During this trip, Biden announces a plan for future collaboration on laser missile defense systems. Yes, lasers. As if Iron Dome weren't futuristic enough now, the alliance has moved into the realm of science fiction. Though still in development, the idea of using lasers to intercept missiles carries all the flair of a Bond villain's toolkit, with far less villainy, thankfully. Back in Israel, reactions to Biden's visit are mixed. The government, now under a more centrist coalition than Netanyahu's previous reign, welcomes him warmly. But right-wing politicians mutter about missed opportunities and American indecision. Meanwhile, Palestinians remain skeptical, grateful for aid pledges, but doubtful that meaningful policy shifts are coming. Biden's visit, though polished, doesn't promise a reboot. It merely promises stability. And maybe that's the point. Biden's Israel trip isn't meant to shake the earth. It's meant to remind everyone that even amidst chaos, the relationship holds. That a US president, even one with a full plate, will still make time to sit with both sides. Even if just for the optics, even if peace is a distant dream. By now, as you drift among the dry hills outside Jerusalem, with the occasional hawk circling in the orange sky, you begin to understand the evolution of these visits. What began with Nixon as a Cold War maneuver has become ritual. Presidents don't just go to Israel because it's strategic, they go because not going would be louder. And Biden's visit, though understated, affirms that rhythm. The pageant of alliances, the whisper of peace, the careful balance of showing up just enough. Because in this game, presence speaks volumes and absence screams. So now you exhale as Marine One lifts off from Israeli soil, leaving behind motorcades, sound bites, and security details. And ahead lies the closing chapter, not of visits, but of why they've become inevitable. Because if you've ever wondered why every president eventually lands here, well, you're about to find out. You float now above the whole timeline, above Nixon's rigid wave, Carter's tearful pleas, Reagan's ghost diplomacy, Bush's defiance, Clinton's warm embrace, Bush Jr.'s late arrival, Obama's calculated pause, Trump's showmanship, and Biden's steady hand. All different men, all different styles, but they all either touched Israeli soil or lived with the consequences of not doing so. And you begin to see it clearly. Visiting Israel isn't a choice anymore. It's a gravitational pull. Presidents might delay, they might fumble, but eventually they all go. Why? Well, because Israel isn't just a country, it's a narrative, a symbol, a voting bloc, a battlefield, a moral mirror, a test of foreign policy mettle and domestic diplomacy, all rolled into one tightly packed strip of Mediterranean earth. And every president, like it or not, steps into that story with the whole world watching and a pen in one hand. At home, the visit plays to different audiences. To evangelical voters, it's affirmation. To Jewish Americans, it's solidarity. To progressives, it's a litmus test. And to political strategists, it's a guaranteed headline. Every photo op at the Western Wall, every speech at Yad Vashem, every handshake with an Israeli prime minister carries multiple meanings, personal, political, historical. And skipping that trip, that's a headline too. But beyond symbolism, there's also real strategy. Israel is a regional hub for US military operations. It hosts joint training, intelligence sharing, weapons testing, and advanced defense tech like Iron Dome and future laser systems. It's the launchpad, the lookout post, and the loyal partner in a region often ruled by shifting sand. Presidents don't just visit Israel, they coordinate there. They brief, negotiate, listen, or at least pretend to. And then there's the international chessboard. American presidents visit Israel to reassure NATO allies, to send messages to Iran, to nudge Gulf states toward normalization. They visit to shore up alliances, to mediate disputes, or to just look busy when peace seems perpetually out of reach. Historians still argue whether these visits make a lasting difference or simply reinforce the illusion of progress. But the illusion matters too. Sometimes standing in Jerusalem feels like you're doing something, especially when Washington feels paralyzed. Here's your final quirky bedtime fact. While every president since Nixon has either visited Israel or made it a central point of policy, the US has never had an ambassador to Israel who wasn't a political appointee. That's right, no career diplomats, just a long parade of trusted insiders, bundlers, allies, and donors. It's a reminder that the relationship is as political as it is personal. And yet, despite all this pageantry, all this pressure, something deeper drives these visits, a shared story, one built on war, survival, democracy, and faith, one wrapped in contradiction and complexity. Presidents come here because, like it or not, the US-Israel relationship is a mirror of American foreign policy itself, hopeful, messy, fiercely loyal, occasionally hypocritical, but always, always present. So by now you understand it's not just tradition, it's necessity. Presidents visit Israel not because it's easy, but because not going speaks louder. Because history echoes louder in Jerusalem than it does in most places, and because sometimes just showing up is the only diplomacy left on the table. And now you exhale slowly, letting the echoes of 9 presidents fade into the sound of distant waves off the Tel Aviv coast. Behind you, the flags are being folded, the reporters are packing up, and the airstrip returns to stillness. You've arrived at the end of the story, so now slow the breath, soften the mind. Let it all fade now. Let the noise of motorcades quiet to the hush of sea wind brushing against desert hills. Picture the golden stones of Jerusalem slowly turning pink in the evening light, the way ancient cities do when the world finally stops staring. The flashbulbs are gone, the crowds have melted into alleyways, and what remains is just the soft echo of footsteps on limestone. You're still there, but only as a whisper. The speeches have ended, the visits are over, the pages of history have been pressed closed just for tonight. The Western Wall stands silent. The olive trees sway slowly in the breeze. Somewhere beyond the checkpoints and beyond the cameras, a child in Haifa, or maybe Ramallah, is falling asleep, too oblivious to the visits, the handshakes, the policy debates. Just another night beneath a very old sky. Let yourself slow now. Let the rhythm of history soften into breath. Let the facts blur gently into dreams. No need to remember every date or every quote. Just carry the feeling, that quiet truth, that even the most powerful people on earth must at some point make a humble stop in a land where stories began. The jet engines are cooling, the flags are folding, the sun has set over the Negev, and you've made the full journey, eyes closed, heart full.